Hey folks, thanks for being here. So what I want to talk about after the dust settles is a little bit about what I've learned about incidents. But to kind of go back a little bit, something I wanted to mention is that I have a love-hate relationship with endings. So especially movie endings, unless it's like a Disney or like a rom-com level of like happily ever after, I'm usually quite frustrated at the end of movies. Part of this is because they have me hooked at the end, like I finally know what's going on, the patterns are finally making sense, and then it ends. Some of this is storytelling, but then I'm usually just like frustrated. So one clear example for this was the Avengers movie. So the first one, if it's been a while since you've watched it or you haven't seen it, the plot of the movie is we have these superpowered humans that come together to save the day after an alien attack hits New York. And of course, as in these big movies, New York is destroyed. They do save the day, but in the process, like Midtown does not exist at the end of the movie. And then like at the end, they just like go and like eat shawarma. And I'm like, no, can you just like go like put New York back together before y'all go like relax a little bit? Like, what are we doing? And actually this concept was also influenced by this video that I watched called the Marvel cleanup crew that was talking about all of the efforts that probably have to happen behind the scenes after like these superheroes come through, because they are, yes, saving the day, but like throwing parts of buildings at these aliens that just, you're not really sure how that helps. A movie that does actually think about this was a following movie called The Spider-Man Homecoming. So the villain from that movie is actually born from the cleanup of the actual Avengers movie. So essentially the villain was working, had a salvage business, so they would clean up when bad things happened and they would sell parts that they would get from these incidents. They found some alien technology and they decided that they were gonna sell the parts and kind of made weapons out of them. And they become this kind of a superpowered human by using this alien technology negatively. And this had me thinking about incidents and the ramifications of them, because often if you don't do your cleanup well after an incident, there's all of these parts that are just like lying around that people should never use, right? Like you made this random script to clean up your cluster after the fact. No one should hit all the clusters at once. There is no testing, there is no railings on this. So no one should actually use it. But if you just like leave it hanging around, someone's gonna be like, oh, I've always wanted to hit all my clusters at once. And then all of a sudden it leads to another incident. So this had me thinking about how these ramifications of previous incidents and future incidents really kind of have like a symbiotic relationship. Because if we think about the incident life cycle, we're mostly thinking about it as being like a forward-moving thing, right? We have the incident, we've declared it, we fix it, and I'm really fuzzing over that middle part because it is the hard portion. But then we're tired and we want to relax, but then we have to do all of the incident cleanup afterwards, right? That's when we now have the post-incident report and we write the retrospectives. But by then, you're pretty tired. But we know what the tasks that we have to do are, right? We have to do the actual cleanup, and then we have to capture and save any relevant information. So you have to go screenshot all your graphs because they look differently 24 hours from now and definitely 30 days from now. And you have to write up and have a lot of investigation and examples of how things actually went wrong, delete all of the random things that you tried that didn't work or worked too well. And then there's some follow-up remediation work. And this isn't the room where I should really talk about the reason why we do this, but I'll cover it briefly. We all know about learning from incidents. Like the continuous learning aspect from these are great. I think of incidents as unplanned investments in our reliability, right? Like we did not intend to spend that much time on a part of our system until we found out it was broken. And that's really helpful because we did not know our system could break that way. And that's how I think about every incident. It's like, it's never broken that way before. Now we have to make sure it never breaks that way again, right? Which makes us better engineers. We also have to do a lot of coordination, because what if we broke someone else's system in a new way, or they broke ours because of these dependencies? If we both broke each other, that's a circular dependency, and you should definitely fix that ASAP. We also have obligations to our customers, of course, with service level agreements and objectives in place. We have to make sure that all of the work that we do has a return on this investment, so that we make sure this doesn't go badly again or similarly in the future. We also know the practices that we're supposed to do during this retrospective period, right? We've heard of some of them. I'm going to repeat them quickly. Some of this is blamelessness, right? We don't want to have the process or the time when we are being mad at each other when we should be mad at the systems, right? They are the evil in this situation. And in general, everyone who's working on a system is not trying to be a bad actor. They all are well-intentioned. If they are trying to be a bad actor, get them out of there. But otherwise, we're assuming that they were doing, they had good intentions, and we're assuming good intent, that they were doing their best as well as they could, right? There's also a part of ownership where we have to figure out which parts of the incident retrospective belong to who, so we make sure that it gets done. In my organization, we actually have an owner for the retrospective process who is accountable to make sure that it happens. But in other places, you might just have the person who was the incident commander make sure that the incident retrospective happens. What's helpful for this is we want to make sure that it gets to the point where the entire retrospective document is filled out, and that's very helpful. But the other part is there are a lot of these other subtasks that come within a retrospective of the cleanup task, where we have to do something in our system and another team has to do something in their system, and making it clear so there's no duplication of effort, but also so that there isn't any confusion and something gets dropped. There's also collaboration that I was just describing, right? Like, we all have different perspectives and backgrounds, and we're all trying to do our best, so making sure we're aligned on that is something that's very helpful, coming together to make our systems better. Lastly, one of kind of a best practice, like I'm describing, of this retrospective process is timeliness. At my organization, we try to have our retrospective done within 5 days. I've heard some systems do that faster than that. That's just because sometimes your retention period for your communication where the incident happened might not be that long. So we want to make sure we get all of that data down as quickly as possible while it's still fresh. And the pain you still kind of feel because it just happened to you less than a week ago. And so we get that down before another incident comes over and kind of maybe may take precedent over your time and energies. So I've given this talk before, and a question that I had was, how do you feel about the post-incident review and retrospective process? And this room might have a different reply to that. But how many folks feel positively about that process? I would say it's about half of the room, but some people were very kind of like, about it. And I kind of feel the same. It's been even less than some other audiences have been part of. And I would say part of that is you probably have had a previous incident retrospective that did not go well. At least that's the case for me. We know what the practices are that you're supposed to do, but they don't always work well in practice, right? So I'm going to have a short incident story where I'm going to describe actually my first incident when I was still a baby SRE, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and was on my first team. So at the time, I was working on an internal team. We provided virtual machines to other systems. So we didn't interface. Our customers were other engineers at the company. So they used our virtual machines as either their personal machine or as their server, which is pretty cool. And if you haven't had a chance to sort of think about or see a virtualization architecture, I have one on the screen here, which sort of shows you that most virtualization, the way it works is you have some either physical or cloud hardware, and then there's an operating system on top of that that the host is on, that is on the host, and then you have a hypervisor that controls all of the virtual machines, and each of the virtual machines also have their own operating systems. So at the time on our team, we needed to reinstall and update the operating system of all of the machines that we had, not only the clusters and the hosts, but also the actual individual virtual machines, which was very difficult. So I was tasked to make sure that this process happened. So from our perspective, this was easier because what we did was we had operations to be able to move all the virtual machines from one host to another. So we would reinstall that host and the cluster that that host is on, and then move them back. So that was easy, theoretically. We had some hiccups, but generally we were able to do that pretty quickly. So we were given a quarter to do this, right? So I started sending out emails to people. So I sent out a lot of emails being like, hey, you have 90 days to reinstall your operating system. You have 60, 30. And then around the 30-day mark, I started switching off people's virtual machines. What happens, though, is that people don't read their emails. I don't know if y'all read your emails, but a lot of people just do not read them. So, which is why I got to the place where by 30 days, I had like 40% of people hadn't done this. So by actually going and switching them off, I had some people reach out and be like, why did that happen? And then I'll be like, because this thing. And they're like, oh, our bad, we missed that. And then they would actually reinstall it. But there are people who just never got or read that email. So at the end of the quarter, I reached out to my team and I was like, hey, there's like a long tail of folks who just have not done this. And they're like, we actually need to get rid of any server that is not on this updated operating system. And they're like, you have to delete it. And I was like, cool. So I just went in and deleted every single server that was not on that current operating system. And I had a great time with it too. It was like, okay, I have completed my project. Literally, this long tail now does not exist. It's gone. Until someone declared an incident. They're like, hey, our server is unavailable. And I was like, yeah, I did that. I deleted it. And they're like, why would you do that? And I was like, well, I emailed y'all like 10 times. Like, we had to do this. They're like, well, give us back our server. And I was like, I cannot. It is literally gone. Here's a new server, but you know, I don't know what was in your server, so like, build it back up again. And they're like, we don't know how to do that. And I was like, that is awkward. I also do not know how to do that because it's your server. I gave you an equivalent one. What do we now do? So we immediately went to the incident retrospective because there's nothing else to literally do there. There was no cleanup. It was too clean, actually, because there was literally nothing there. The relevant data was my emails that were unread. But then we came to the investigation portion. And a lot of things happened at the same time, which was different people's faults. So first of all, we actually had a concurrent project that was deprecating our old database that stored all of the names of our incidents, the instances or the hosts with the team that owned them, because we realized that they weren't correct. So what happened was these teams weren't getting my emails because literally their information wasn't correct in our database. So the person who built their server and spun it up has since been removed from the team, left the company, or by their own choice, like they've moved on. So literally, no one knows what's happening because that person who had their email on there is no longer with the company, so they didn't get my emails. The other thing that came up during the investigation process was the reason that we needed to delete all of these machines was because there was a security vulnerability. So this was during the time of the Spectre vulnerability, so literally anything that was on the old operating system was vulnerable to the company, so it had to be gone. So that really changes the perspective that I had, but obviously this team was still mad. And they weren't just mad, they were mad at me specifically because I deleted their server. And their retrospective document said, Ajuna deleted our server. And I was like, hey, like, I just read the book. It said we're not supposed to do this. But there it was, my name with my email, deleted our server. And that was very awkward for me because this is my first time kind of going through this. I'd done other incidents where I was like shadowing or kind of on call, but I had a teammate. This was my first time kind of owning this thing. And there was my name on a negative thing saying that it was my fault. The next part came in the who is the owner here, right? How do we make sure that we complete this process of retrospective? Because we were having this argument still of if we deleted their server, we were responsible for their server, so we should rebuild it, but we didn't have that access. And because these teams were internal facing, they didn't do all of the work of having disaster recovery and all of this process in place. They had never rebuilt their server from scratch. They always assumed it would work well. So they were like, you are the SRE team, you're supposed to do that. And we were like, no, all we are responsible for is making sure that that machine that you gave, like we gave to you, just works correctly. What happens within it is kind of all on you. Thankfully, there was good collaboration, right? I had to also take myself out of it and realize that I have just suddenly given this team a gigantic project that they did not plan for, and I do really feel bad about that. My team also came in and they co-signed me because I got approvals from them to do all of the things, and so the retrospective document changed to saying virtualization team deleted our server for the vulnerability reasons, and as such, whatever we can do to help you kind of have the practices of disaster recovery, we will. And so we will try to have processes to switch off your server more often so that you can actually practice these before something gets this big. But what that brought up to me was, when do these things we know to be practices or things that we know to be true kind of become culture? When do these learnings that we have of the right way to do things actually impact us to the point that when we are frustrated and things have gone wrong, we actually do them the right way? And how do we just learn in general? So that took me to another path. This is after I stopped being an SRE. I'm now working as a developer advocate, so I'm now thinking about these kind of objectively, and that got me thinking about just how do we learn. So I heard about this thing called the learning pyramid, which some people do not agree with at all, but the concept kind of stuck with me. So I discussed the idea that in order to learn, we have to do. So first of all, we learn by reading. So we start off reading about a thing, and then maybe we write the thing, and then we do the thing, and then we teach the thing. So if we think about software, we start reading design documents and reading our team's code, and then we write new code in there, and then we test the code, we have incidents, and then maybe we teach other people or write a new way of expanding that code in a new design document, and that's how we kind of get better at things. So when I showed you this incident life cycle before as kind of like a straight diagram of a straight arrow, it was actually not very correct. It's more cyclical than that. Each incident that we have feeds into a new one because the learnings that we had from the past one impact the new one. Some aspects, the frustrations we had from the old one kind of bleed into the new one as well. But generally, as we're reading all post-mortems and have a new incident, we're gonna do the things that we knew worked well and not do the things that didn't work in the past incident, right? So it all kind of feeds into each other. This is also kind of highlighted by the Google SRE book. So they have a diagram in the chapter about accelerating SREs to be on call that also talks about kind of how do SREs go from the baby SRE to actually knowledgeable people on the team and able to handle larger scale incidents. So from the top left, it kind of talks about them reading, right? Like reading postmortems, they have learning experiences, and then they start reading documentation and use that kind of like as an apprenticeship, and then they start writing into the documentation, but then also doing like disaster role plays, which is part of the doing. And as we're moving kind of like to the left and down, they are reverse engineering things, they're breaking things by doing and kind of fixing things. And as such, they'll get to a place where they do more project work and ownership, and they'll get to the teaching aspect of it. So they become more senior kind of going through that learning process. So I've been thinking about learning from incidents even before I got here, though this has been very cool for me. Like I said, I don't work on incidents directly anymore, but I've been looking for opportunities to learn from them whenever it kind of strikes me as interesting. So I've learned from some of the incident stories that I've experienced today, but one aspect that I needed to learn about was DNS. So despite being an SRE, I did not know much about networking. I mostly worked on the software side, and I always heard that if something can go wrong, it's always DNS. It's been 0 days since it wasn't DNS. And I was like, that's a funny saying. Like, I know what DNS does, but like, why do you feel so strongly against DNS? So then I started trying to read up on incidents that were the fault of DNS that impacted me. So in October 2021, WhatsApp and other parts of Meta went down for like 6 hours. So I don't know if anyone in the room uses WhatsApp that much. I'm from Tanzania. That's the main way I communicate with my family. And not hearing from them for 6 hours was weird, right? And my mom had to SMS me. It was almost like she emailed me. Like, it was so strange, because I was like, what are we doing? I can't hear from y'all. So essentially, all of Facebook, Meta, so Instagram as well, went down from like 11 a.m. Eastern to like, I think that's about like 5 or 6 p.m. Eastern, so it was a really big deal. So I went into reading what their outage details were. So it's not quite a full like retrospective document, but as much information as they can share being a big tech company, right? So essentially, in their document, they shared that their outage was caused because their backbone connectors between their like points of presence to their data centers went down. So obviously, we are able to communicate with Facebook through the internet, through these points of presence that will actually get to the data centers and kind of come back. But what happened was they were testing out their connections within this service, and instead of testing to see the availability, it just took them all down. And the processes that they had in place to audit these commands and make sure that that doesn't happen also failed. So everything went down. So the secondary problem that they had from that was because nothing could communicate with their data centers, their border gateway protocol also couldn't connect their data centers to their DNS servers. So it assumed that those connections were bad and assumed that DNS was down, despite the fact that it wasn't, so it disconnected from DNS. So that means that nothing could communicate with anything, to the point that their internal systems that even give them access to their building was down. So they, another way I found out about this was I knew people who worked at Facebook who said, we went to work but couldn't get into our building, and we just didn't know what to do, so we went home. And I was like, that makes sense. This is, what else do you do if you can't access anything, your computer doesn't work? But what I found funny, and I felt for them, but I thought it was funny that they had to break into their own buildings to fix this problem. And I did think that that was very funny.
A lot of us did.
Thank you. But eventually they did get in and were able to kind of bring their backbone back up. And as such, DNS came back up and they were able to connect to their systems again. And I finally was like, oh, that's how DNS works. Thank you. So that whole process was me being like, okay, I finally kind of get it. Like, networking was never a strong point of mine, but like reading about it in an incident that impacted me in a way really kind of brought it into my head. And that has gotten, even during this conference, I learned about CDN and some of the instance stories earlier today, and there are many others that have been going. I've mostly spent a lot of time in Red Rover so I can hear some of these instance stories, because literally that is how I spend a lot of my time learning. So to sort of recap, we all know that incidents are complex, and a big part of that is because the technology, the processes are hard, but also the people are hard. We know that there are things that we should be doing, but to actually do them in the time of stress is very, very difficult. And we need to practice these best practices, as we call them, so that they become culture and kind of easy for us to do immediately, and we believe the best that in the folks that are working with us, hug ops and all of these other things to be practiced, right? But also, like, the sharing the stories of these incidents is super helpful, and this is probably the audience that needs to know this the least. But I think that when we're training new folks in SRE, DevOps, or just folks who are interested in systems in general, being able to have these stories to learn from in various ways, not just within software, but also outside from that, really gives us a lot of knowledge that we didn't know about and kind of trains us to be the next Avengers or whatever process we're really thinking about here, right? We have to share this information with people for it to sort of stick. And as Uncle Ben says in the sudo command copied, with great power comes great responsibility. We really need to kind of practice this, as we are the thing between folks being able to access their systems and not in a lot of times. So with that, I'm wrapping things up. Again, we're back to another ending, and I said I have a love-hate relationship with those. But I hope that this was helpful to you. My name is Ajuna Kyaruzi. I work as an SRE and DevOps advocate at Datadog. And it was really helpful for me to be here and learn from y'all, and thank you for coming and chatting with me. Thanks so much.